Hello and welcome back to Philosophical Conversations. I'm Giorgi Khuroshvili. We are in the country of Georgia and the program is presented by New Georgia University. And today we discuss populism, the history of populism as well as current populist trends. And I'm very pleased to be joined in this conversation by Dr. Detlef von Daniels. Dr. Daniels is a research fellow at Berlin-brandenburgis Academy and is a coordinator of the research group for international justice and institutional responsibility. Dr. Daniels, thanks for joining. And let me start our interview by asking you about the origins of populism and populism as such. Could you briefly explain what is populism as such, and in particular, what is the political populism or populism politics?
Yes, so thank you for inviting me here. The question, what exactly is populism, is indeed an interesting and difficult one, because usually what one says is populism, the other one says is democracy. So quite a few people or quite a few movements have been denounced as populist, whereas they themselves say, no, we are actually the real Democrats. So it is not just labeling someone as a populist doesn't say that he is a populist. But there are still some characteristics one can use to define what populism is. So the first would be to distinguish populists from democratic movement. So the first characteristic would be that usually populists make a very sharp distinction between we, who are the real people, and the other ones. So this is the first characteristic. Whenever you have a political party that says that we are not just one party amongst several different parties, but we are the party, or we are the only party that represent the people or the real people, then you can be pretty sure that's a populist party. The second characteristic is that they often have problems with the form of pluralistic society. Pluralistic society means that first of all there are different, let's say, semi-autonomous groups in society. These semi-autonomous groups can be, these can be, for instance, churches, but these can be also unions. This is also, of course, the media. So these are groups that are semi-autonomous, that can challenge the government. Populist parties usually have a problem with these semi-autonomous groups. And one important institution is the law. So the law, which has its own form of legitimization, which is independent from the democratic legitimation. That's also something populist parties or movements often have a problem. The third characteristic one could use is to say that there is a charismatic leader. This is only a weak characteristic, because there are also some democratic parties who have very charismatic leaders. But quite often you find this form of charismatic leader. The idea of the charismatic leader also relates back to the other characteristic I've named, especially with leaders such as Donald Trump. He uses the Twitter to communicate directly with the citizens. So someone who tries to get around those institutions, such as the media, such as the law, or other institutions.
Right. Well, the phenomenon of populism was also very well known in the ancient world as well. Greek philosopher Plato was no fan of democracy, and especially the form of democracy he witnessed in the 4th century Athens, thought that populists do prevail in democracies, and democracies often can be subverted into tyrannies. Actually, he gives rather interesting account of that process. So, could you just clarify Plato's position in this regard, and what was Plato's position towards the relation of populist politics and democracy?
Yes, so when we talk about Plato, we have to realize at what time he himself lived and the time he set his dialogue. So he set his dialogue in the 5th century, but of course he lived in the 4th century. And he didn't do this just so he didn't write his dialogues just to record what Socrates and other people said in the 5th century, but he wanted to really give some influence in the 4th century, at a time when there were shifting balances. Athens was a democracy, but it was no longer a very, very, very big power. What one can say, the arts really were at a very high level at this time, and the Politeia was the first major book ever written then in Greece. So the first major book after the big books by Homer. And so everyone would expect something from the Politeia, like a sermon on the greatness of Athens and on how bad the tyranny is in Persia, let alone in the Barbarian countries, which is all around the world. But Plato doesn't do this. So he writes a book which is extremely complicated, and he comes to the idea of the different forms of a government only at the very end of this very, very long book. And then he writes something about Athens and democracy, which everyone who lived in Athens would have realized, no, this is not really how our politics work. So the account is not quite correct, and it almost sounds like a smear critique. So the way he's describing these democratic forms of government. So one has to ask, and even the people at this time would have to ask him, what does he really want to do? So why is he describing Athens in this way? Where is he driving at? And I think what you'll see even in this account of democracy is that first of all he wants to bring people into philosophy. So he wants to say, now this is not just doing politics and it's not enough. You have to go through the whole way of the Politeia. You have to go through the whole way of thinking to realize what really the good is. So don't just look at politics. Now this is his overall program. Nevertheless, there are some specific points he sees in democracy, and especially in the form of democracy which is prevalent in Athens at this time. And what his argument is that tyranny arises out of no other form than out of a democracy. And this is, of course, a very difficult point to realize, because people at Athens thought, now we are the most developed people. How is it possible that we, as the most developed people, are the ones who give rise to the worst regime? So like a regime in Persia, or like a regime somewhere to be found in the so-called barbarian nations. And this is again the Platonic point that he says that the best, but also the worst impulses come out of yourself. They come out of your soul, and if you don't go deep enough in your soul, if you stop, so to say, halfway and going all the way through philosophy, then something like this can happen.
I see. Well, commonly it is believed that populism prevails in democracies. However, we have examples in history when populist elements emerged in totalitarian or authoritative regimes. The best example of that is Nazi Germany or Soviet Union. So how do you think, what is the role of populism in such regimes, in totalitarian and authoritarian regimes?
So the first question would be the origin of populism, or the origin of authoritarian regimes. And I think in this respect, Germany is the most telling example, because Nazi Germany, or Germany in the 1930s, was before the Nazi regime the Weimar Republic. This was a fairly good constitution. It was a democratic state. It was a state with a with a high level of culture. So they had more or less everything. Of course, there were lots of conflicts, but nothing in a way which is really terrible. So there was not famine or anything like this. And nevertheless, even though there was this high level of education and so on, nevertheless it was possible that Hitler arose out of this context. And I think this is something so the one aspect you can learn and think about of the origin of Nazi Germany. The other point, of course, you can learn about is how to act as a populist leader. What do you do? And this is more or less a rule book you will find in many different countries. So, for instance, you first have to get rid of the independent media. You have to get rid of the independent law. You have to try to be charismatic. You give out some plays like the Romans did bread and butter for the ordinary people. So these are things you find in Nazi Germany, but also in many different countries, which is in a way not that interesting as this is the ordinary rule book of every authoritarian leader.
Yeah. Well, the famous Nazi political theorist Carl Schmitt also gave some thoughts to the idea of populism and populism as such. So, could you clarify Schmitt's view of populism and how much does it differ from Platonic one?
Yes, when we talk about Schmitt's view, one has to realize that most of his important writings come from his time when he was a constitutional lawyer at the time of the Weimar Republic. So this was the time when he developed many of his views, and at this time he was, one can say, one of the first to really develop a populist theory, not just acting like a populist politician, but developing a populist theory, and also using it to a specific political end. So the way he developed his populist theory is found in various writings, where he changed the political ontology of liberalism by saying that the basic political distinction is this between friend and foe. And this is not just a theory, this is something you can work out within constitutional theory. So within constitutional theory, he showed or he argued that at this time the conservative president of the Republic was the only one who represented the real we, whereas what he saw is the pluralistic parliament and the pluralistic society is not the real we. Again, we find that the very same distinction I've mentioned earlier, the one between who's the real people, who's the real we, and who's the other one. And this is something he used within constitutional theory, and he really made these arguments as a lawyer and as a lawyer in a democratic state. The other point about Schmitt being a Nazi theorist is certainly also important. It is important to realize that he used this very same arguments he developed as a democratic or as a constitutional lawyer of the Weimar Republic in Nazi times, and he used it, of course, then to justify the rise of Hitler, to justify the power of Hitler. One has, however, to admit that his writings especially the early 1930s, they were extremely shameless and often simply extremely bad. Nevertheless, he was an influential figure for different people on the right as on the left.
I see. Well, today we see a strong wave of populism in many democracies. We see populist politicians in the left-wing, centrist, and right-wing political spectrum. So how would you characterize current trends of populism, and what would Plato or Carl Schmitt say about these present trends of populism?
Yes, so when we talk about right and left-wing populism, one has to realize that quite often even left-wing populists, when they try to develop some theory, they refer back to Carl Schmitt, which shows that maybe they have the same idea, that they want to identify the real, and now this time the real forces are usually not called the forces who are the real people, but the forces who have the enlightened consciousness, or the forces who are the revolutionary consciousness, and who are for this reason the real people. So what I think, first of all, what we can learn from Carl Schmitt is how to theorize those movements, and how to realize that they are not simply not simply uneducated, or they are not simply, as Hillary Clinton once said, the deplorables. This is an unhealthy, not very helpful way to deal with people, just to call them deplorables, or to think that they are in some ways simply not intelligent enough. So this is the one point you learn from Carl Schmitt. However, what you don't learn from Carl Schmitt is how to fight against them. If you want to learn how to fight against them, then you have to turn to his major opponent, which is Hans Kelsen at the time of the Weimar Republic. And Hans Kelsen was someone who was probably really the only one who really met Carl Schmitt on his very own field, which is constitutional theory. So he argued as a constitutional lawyer to say exactly at what point something is going wrong, not simply at what point of his grand theory, but also where does he make a wrong legal argument, where does he propose some form of social facts which are maybe wrong or one-sided. So he really goes down and does the very ordinary work of fighting every bits and pieces, not just on the very high theoretical level, but also on the very ordinary political level. So I think this is the one part you can learn from the opponent of Carl Schmitt, so from Hans Kelsen. What you still learn from Plato is that even if you think you've got the right view, or if you have a, let's say, liberal consciousness, that even then it's not yet the end of the story. You have, if you want to be a philosopher, you have to go deeper, and you have to go, so to say, into the soul if you want to search for the origins of the good.
Detlef von Daniels, thanks for your time and thanks for your answers.
Thanks for having me.